Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I have to say that we've been working on the issues of outsourcing in the public and private sector for, I suppose, about 4 or 5 years now. But it was really only when the management of my university decided to outsource all of the services within my university that I really thought, my God, this is about the reality. This is the craziness that is beginning to infect the whole of the world, that I began to try and put together some of the work that was needed doing. Because the problem is that there is doubt, but the doubt never comes into the heads of the policymakers who are taking the decision. The doubts, for example, the Institute of Fiscal Studies report, which is in favour of outsourcing, as was the report for the Audit Commission in 2007. They admit, in small print, they admit that there is uncertainty about the question of the costs. But then you go a little bit further to the actual policymakers, and you find that, no, they are absolutely certain. And we'll look at some of the evidence they use in a moment. But outsourcing, what is it? Now, clearly taking work away from the principal. Offshoring in many cases, but principally in the public services, it's peculiar that you don't actually have to invest very much. What you do is you use the facilities of the organisation which has been provided in the past by the public to do your work. So you carry out that work on the premises using the equipment very often of the principal. But what essentially you're doing in the value chain is you're shifting the value chain to another indirectly related organisation. And as we can see at the end, this produces quite a significant set of problems which are usually not taken into account when the question of what the costs and the benefits are actually considered. Outsourcing as compared to subcontracting, outsourcing tends to be used when this shift is a permanent one and actually means that you are losing those skills amongst your permanently employed workforce. A picture of how it works, we've all seen this. I mean, the economists famously use the term disintegration, productive disintegration, in terms of the manufacturing sector. But essentially, you're moving from one more or less unified organisation to a first stage where outsourced support services are sort of separated out, and with the managers of the outsourcing companies becoming more important. And then to a third stage in many organisations where effectively you have the restriction of core activities to a very small level, and essentially the managers of outsourcing companies becoming the strategic centre of the presentation of your activities and so on. Now that picture's obviously familiar to most of you. But why do public organisations do it? Well, the first argument is that large vertical organisations often underperform, and that this happens more frequently than if you have smaller specialist ones. Now, of course, the issue of smaller is a little bit sort of strange, because many of the outsourcing companies are now twice, 3 times, 4 times the size of the organisations they're providing services to. But that's the logic, that the size is a problem to performance. Outsourcing, it's argued, can reduce costs. Outsourcing can stimulate innovation, in the theory that if you have a free market, these outsourcing companies will compete and will try and get better at what they're doing, and therefore there will be innovation in outsourcing that will then come and feed back into the processes that you need completed. And then, of course, the third argument is that outsourcing can maintain or even improve quality. We've all heard these arguments before. The second argument is that, well, okay, you've got this problem of like communication with this new batch of managers from external companies, but actually, thanks to new technologies, we can offset any potential increase in the transaction costs that occur. The old argument that companies grow in order to reduce transaction costs when they have businesses operating in different parts of the country, different sorts of sets of activities, that you grow your organisation to keep everything internal. The argument is, well, that is no longer necessary because information technology means that you can have different units doing different things. They can all be coordinated so much more simply through IT, and that will therefore mean that you don't have increased costs when you separate off different chunks. The third argument, of course, is one we recognise, which is the political pressure we spoke about, to reduce directly employed headcount. And then I have to say, and it's absolutely clear, that amongst most of these processes, fashion amongst managers, is an important part. Oh, well, if somebody else is doing it, well, why aren't we doing it as well, is the question that's asked. So what's the evidence base? Well, as I say, the argument is that quality can be improved through reorganising service delivery. It will reduce costs for new staff. It's absolutely clear, this does happen. Wages, benefits and pensions can be reduced for new employed staff. And then the classic, that it will provide 10 to 30% typical cost savings. And what is extraordinary, absolutely sort of straight, I thought 10 to 30% cost saving, that's a lot, I thought, that's a lot, by getting people who don't know the job to start doing the job and going on doing it. I thought that's a little bit strange. And so I began to think, well, where does this come from? And then you find that the same figure is repeated in all the main documents that are used and have been used by government for the last 5 years, this includes a period of Labour government, to justify this process. KPMG does it, the Policy Exchange, the CBI, Burr, they all have this data. And when they allow themselves the luxury of quoting where it comes from, because otherwise it's just pub talk, isn't it? Oh, well, you get a lot better. When they allow themselves the luxury of doing that, what they then refer to is the Australian Industry Commission report of 1996. Now, so that means, of course, that I had to read the Australian Industry Commission report of 1996. And I can absolutely assure you, I don't think any of the people who wrote those policy documents have actually read that report, because the report is much more nuanced than their assumptions are making. And I've got two rather long extracts here. Essentially, the Australian Industry Commission report, and don't forget this is Australian in the mid-1990s, extreme right-wing government, very, very much interested in sort of pushing back the state and so on from an ideological point of view. They recognise that there was a keen debate about competitive tendering, right? And what they do in their document is they look at 203 studies that have been made of the effect of outsourcing. Now, most of these, something like 2/3, are Australian studies, and primarily they're dealing with contracting out cleaning operations. And one of the main authors of this report, or the contributors to the report, I should say, did a study of 95 operations in the early 1990s in contracts in the early 1990s in Australia. Anyway, so this is the body of research they're dealing with. Basically, the studies from the early 1980s to about 1992, where primarily what can be described, what the Danish report subsequently described as technical services, which is, by technical services they mean services like cleaning, effectively kind of physical manual jobs like dustbin delivery and so on, which have, if you like, fairly defined and distinctive roles. When it comes to the other kind of services, which are social services, human resource management, which are much more integrated, the data is actually very, very different from that on the technical services. But these ones in this Australian Commission report are actually 90% of them are studies of technical outsourcing, technical processes. And there, if you look at the math, I mean, it just sort of 75% of surveyed, 75% of 203 found that CTC reduced the ongoing costs. Savings ranged in over half of the services studied. Well, this is now the source, this is the figure, which then says that cost savings are typically 10 to 30%. Now, get your head around that if you can, right? Understand what exact proportions they're talking about. And of course, they then qualify, because this is a serious study, they then go on, and there's lots and lots and lots of qualifications to that figure. They indicate, for example, that they haven't included, almost all the studies they look at don't include the relevant costs. How much did it cost to start up the process of outsourcing? What management time is involved? Then, absolutely critical, only I think 5 or 6 of all of these studies were before and after. Well, how on earth can you actually do an analysis that actually compares properly in that case? 4 of those before and after studies were actually UK studies. 1 by the CBI found cost cuts, 1 by the Citizens Charter found cost cuts, and the 2 academic studies done in the 1980s found that there was a variety of differences in the before and after between cost increases of up to 10% and cost decreases of 10%. So you've got a picture which is absolutely unclear, which is unfounded, which is not at all in line with this notion that you typically get these results. So what do we see? Deloitte Consulting Report 2005, a very interesting study where Deloitte in America does a study of all the large numbers of multinationals and finds actually don't do it, they say. More and more bringing it back in-house. There's an international review, actually it's not 100 studies, I'm sorry, it's 75 studies produced just last year between 2000 and 2010 of all the international studies, and that is again really nuanced. What it says is, be wary, don't do it, particularly don't do it outside technical services, and if you're going to do it at all, make sure the conditions under which it occurs are appropriate. What they show is that you can reduce the headcount, that you will produce profits for outsourcing providers, but nobody does an accurate assessment of the setting up costs, and nobody really establishes what are the costs, the transaction costs involved in the continuing process of negotiation. A study by Cardiff Davis in 2010 in the UK actually sort of summarises it. There was initially that link. Those Domberger and Rimmer reports are about that Australian study, right? Their initial reports identifying a link between contracting out and cost, but today the evidence is seen as absolutely mixed. There is a real doubt as to where the savings are made, and a real doubt as to where those savings, if any, come from. So then, does it improve quality? Well, even the government's own report here in 2007 says there's a dearth of recent case study material. But it goes on to say that under the right conditions, it can happen. And when you look at the evidence base, again, another Cardiff University report, what actually happens is that the evidence base includes a study where they recognise in the small print that actually there is not retrospective analysis of quality. So what senior managers are saying is, we will improve our quality, and this is then recorded, this is going to improve quality, and then they don't look, they don't measure, they don't go back to it. Well, would you? If you make a big decision, right, do you really want to know subsequently that you made a mess of it? They don't do it. Right? And how much will you pay to do it? Will you get somebody else? So they don't do it. Well, how on earth can you then make a sustained argument about improved quality if you don't do it? I mean, it is. And what's very interesting there is they do survey local authority officers, and they actually found a difference between the senior managers who did believe that there were efficiency costs in all of this, and the people who were actually on the ground, right? Managers on the ground, the people delivering the services, only 39% believe that in their experience, people who've gone through the massive changes in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and say only 40% believed to increase, and this is the line, of course, that they're following here too. So without evidence. Of course, the evidence on cleaning in hospitals is now well known, and so significant doubts about, even in the cleaning areas, whether or not outsourcing can improve quality. So what are the right conditions? Well, this again is interesting, because when you look at the international reports and you see the Scandinavian material, they say, well, you've got to have transparency. They think this is normal, high trust, involvement of the staff, collective bargaining in good faith, no loss of entitlements, consensus on improving service. And if you have all those conditions, then maybe you will make cost savings and improve quality. That's, okay, fine. And of course, then the business conditions, and these are important, because this issue of task segmentation, the more integrated the service that's being outsourced, actually, the more the transaction costs of working with those other managers increase and make it unlikely to receive any cost benefit whatsoever. So finally, structural problems. What is actually taking place is that when you outsource, when you shift part of your value chain to external providers, what you're doing is giving power. You're distributing power to this other provider. Now that in itself, ultimately, and these studies really confirm, right, that because you can't measure exactly what is happening, right, when you look at the situation, you are dealing with time spent in negotiation, in renegotiation, time spent in deciding what the targets of the new buy power situation, where you've got two sources of power, the main organisation, the outsourcing organisation, and very often multiple outsourced organisations. So by distributing the locus of power, what effectively you're doing is making sure that the power that was once within your organisation is now a matter of negotiation. And of course, the purpose of the negotiating for outsourcing company is to make a profit from the operation. So the negotiations that then create a structural difficulty about achieving any of the alleged targets. So the only thing we can absolutely conclude from the evidence is that outsourcing will lead to worsening terms for newly employed workers. And the evidence there shows that once this happens, right, the older workers start disappearing who've stayed, who've transferred into the new organisation, start moving out, because it's just not nice. The increased workloads, all the pressure and so forth, it's not the same as it was before. They start moving out, and ultimately those who remain would then be subject to the same newer, worser conditions than those. So there's cost savings. There are cost savings for workers. Right? Costs, what we receive is reduced. I can call that saving. What we get is cut, but actually from the organisation's point of view, right, that difference is actually translated into the profits, the rents, if you like, that the outsourcing company is making. So there are a few references in the paper. Thank you very much.